had a world of my own, everything would be nonsense. Nothing would be what it is, because everything would be what it isn't. And contrariwise, what it is, it wouldn't be. And what it wouldn't be, it would. You see?
Welcome to Wonderland. Come in, have no fear.
Welcome to Wonderland, where self-discovery takes a curious and whimsical turn. This is Wonderland Unlocked, a journey into the heart of Wonderland itself, exploring the emotions, struggles, and personal growth that shape who we are. I'm Courtney, a peer support specialist with my own winding path through identity, emotions, and transformation. Inspired by my experiences and the lessons I've learned, I created this series to explore how the characters of Wonderland connect to our real-life challenges. In each episode, we'll shine a light on a different Wonderland character, uncovering what their story teaches us about ourselves. From Alice's search for identity to the Mad Hatter's chaos, the Cheshire Cat's wisdom to the Queen of Hearts' fury, we'll explore what their journeys reveal about our own. So take a step down the rabbit hole, embrace the unexpected, and let's unlock Wonderland within.
Alice, sweetheart, it's time for tea. Alice? Alice?
Alice didn't mean to fall. She was just following something small. A curiosity. A question. A white rabbit disappearing into the unknown. She wasn't planning on losing herself. And yet, before she could stop it, she was falling, tumbling deeper and deeper into a world that made no sense. Maybe you know that feeling too. Maybe one day the world made sense until it didn't. Maybe emotions started feeling bigger than they should. Maybe your mind started racing in directions you didn't understand. Maybe the way that you reacted to things felt like too much or not enough. And maybe, like Alice, you started questioning everything. That's when the fall begins. I know Wonderland well. Not the kind with tea parties and talking cats, but the Wonderland inside. The chaos of thoughts that won't quiet. The emotions that feel too big. The strange, shifting world of mental health, identity, and self-understanding. And if you're here, then maybe, just maybe, you've fallen down the rabbit hole too. But here's a secret. Wonderland isn't something to escape. It's just something to understand. Like Alice, I felt myself tumbling deeper and deeper into something I couldn't understand. Something that started as small, curious thought. At first, it was barely noticeable. There were hints, glimmers of unease that seemed to appear from nowhere. One moment, life felt manageable, and the next, it was like everything became out of control. The first tipping point for me came in junior high. The bullying didn't just start overnight. It wasn't the loud kind. It was a subtle, sneaky, but it cut deep. I was dismissed by my parents, which made everything worse. I wasn't just being ignored at school. I was being told I didn't matter at home either. That combination made me question everything about myself. I was confused. How could I be so different from the people around me? Why was I treated like I was invisible? It wasn't a single moment, but a slow descent. Over time, I felt like I was fading, becoming smaller and smaller. I didn't belong anywhere. I didn't know who I was, and I certainly didn't know where I fit into this world. Alice drinks a potion and shrinks. She eats a cake and grows. She has no control over her size. There were days where I felt like the world was too big for me, like I couldn't control my emotions. I was overwhelmed by everything, by the weight of being misunderstood, by the chaos in my own head. On other days, I felt nothing at all. The emptiness was just as terrifying. But it was like this. One day, I was too much, and the next, I was too little. I couldn't control either side of it. And much like Alice in Wonderland, I didn't know how to handle the unpredictable changes. Along Alice's journey, she meets characters that challenge her, each one representing a different aspect of the world around her. The Mad Hatter, the Treasure Cat, the Queen of Hearts. All of them are unpredictable, each in their own way. And I met emotions that felt the same way. The racing mind, the impulsive reaction, the mask I wore to hide my struggles. Each emotion seemed to take on a life of its own. These were the characters that I had to learn how to understand before I could begin to make sense of my journey. In Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter's world is a paradox of time, conversation, and disorder. The tea party he hosts is stuck in a perpetual loop, where the clock strikes tea time forever. Time doesn't work, and the conversations are full of absurdity, jumping from topic to topic, with no coherent flow. The Hatter's chaotic world mirrors the experience of having a racing mind, where thoughts swirl out of control, spinning in a web of confusion. For me, my mind often felt like the Mad Hatter's tea party. Conversations and ideas would start, but never have a clear ending. It was as if I'd sit down for a conversation with myself, only for it to shift direction every few moments. I'd get excited about a new thought or project, only to quickly feel distracted, and my focus would fleet away into something else. It's like trying to hold on to a thread of thought, only for it to slip through my fingers. The racing thoughts weren't just random. They were often urgent and demanding. It wasn't uncommon for me to feel overwhelmed by a rush of ideas, questions, or plans. My mind would flood with ideas, things to do, and things to think about. The intensity was almost tangible. It was like my thoughts were moving faster than I could process them, leaving me playing catch-up just to keep up with the pace of my own brain. But there was another side of this chaotic mind, hyperfocus. At times, my mind would latch onto one thing, and I would focus on it intensely. It would be anything, a project, an idea, a conversation, even a feeling. It felt like a tunnel vision, where everything else in the world would fade away as I became completely absorbed in that one thought or task. For hours, I would pour all my energy and attention into this singular focus, losing track of time, completely unaware of anything else happening around me. While this might sound productive or even beneficial, it wasn't always. Sometimes that focus would come at the expense of my well-being. In the thick of it, there was a sense of urgency, a drive to keep going, even when I knew I should step back. But when the hyper-focus ended, when something new caught my attention, the switch was jarring. What made it worse was the exhaustion that followed. While I was hyper-focused, I was fully engaged. But when that moment passed, my attention shifted. I felt drained. The constant shifting between tasks, emotions, or thoughts felt like trying to run a race with no finish line. The mind would jump between multiple gears without pause, never letting me rest. And that exhaustion was deep. It wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. The lack of closure on many of my thoughts, combined with the mental whirlpool I'd been in, would leave me feeling drained in ways that were hard to explain. My brain never stopped running, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was always one step behind, trying to catch up with myself. And this wasn't just distracting, it was debilitating. The mental clutter would never clear, and that lack of clarity contributed to a sense of feeling of lost or disconnected. This was the racing mind I lived with. It was a cycle, and there was little in the ways of break. I would get excited about a new idea and then feel overwhelmed by it as it spiraled into something else. I'd dive into something with all my focus, only to lose interest when something new emerged on the horizon. And the cycle repeated itself endlessly. What I realized over time was, just like the Mad Hatter's tea party, my brain had no clear structure or sense of time. conversations with myself would get interrupted before they had a chance to form. Ideas would bloom and die before they could be fully realized. It was like trying to have a conversation with a friend who constantly interrupted you with new topics, except the friend was inside my own head. The challenge then was understanding that this wasn't just a random event or a passing phase. It wasn't a case of being forgetful or scatterbrained. It was the nature of the way my brain worked, deeply tied to my emotional state and the way I processed stimuli. The impulsive shifts in focus, the racing thoughts, the disjointedness, they weren't random. They were part of a larger emotional pattern I'd come to understand. Learning how to manage this racing mind wasn't about eliminating the chaos. I learned that the hard way. But finding ways to navigate it. I had to give myself permission not to finish every conversation in my head, to stop beating myself up for not being able to sustain focus for long periods, and instead practice mindfulness and grounding techniques. These tools helped me slow down the whirlpool of thoughts, allowing me to recognize when I was slipping into a hyper-focused state and when I needed to take a break. Like Alice, who eventually learns to navigate the madness of Wonderland, I began learning how to live within my own mental chaos. The Mad Hatter's world may not make sense, but recognizing the patterns, acknowledging the racing thoughts, and embracing the hyper-focused loops for what they were, I could start creating structure in a world that seemed impossible to organize. The process wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But eventually, I found a rhythm. I began to understand the purpose in the madness. And just like as Alice found her way through Wonderland, I began to find my way through the madness in my mind. The Cheshire Cat is an ideal representation of the way that I learned to mask my emotions, smiling through the chaos while hiding the mess inside. On the outside, I perfected the art of smiling. I laughed at jokes, I made small talk, and carried on like everything was perfectly fine, whether in social situations, at work, or even just walking through my day. I wore a mask that made it look like I had it all together, but behind the mask, there was a deep sense of disconnect, that I was lost in my own mind, struggling to understand the swirl of emotions that I could never quite pin down. Just like the Cheshire Cat, my smile became a symbol of my internal chaos. I didn't know how to explain what was happening inside me, so I opted for silence. Talking about it felt impossible, not just because I didn't have the right words, but because I feared I wouldn't be understood. I felt like an outsider, like a stranger in my own body. How could I explain the whirlpool of confusion and emotion I was living with if I couldn't even make sense of it myself? The longer I wore the mask, the more disconnected I became from myself. The Cheshire's grin never seemed to fade, even after the cat disappeared, and in a similar way, my smile remained long after I stopped feeling it inside. It wasn't that I didn't want to feel, but I didn't know how to. I would go through the motions of normalcy, doing what was expected of me, engaging with others, and even smiling when I didn't feel it. But inside, it was like I was fading away. I began to feel like a different person, like I was living two separate lives. The person everyone saw, the person who smiled, joked, and acted confident, wasn't the person I felt like I was on the inside. On the inside, there was a void, a sense of lost and stuck. But I couldn't show that part. Instead, I buried it, stuffed my feelings down deeper with each passing day. The mask became second nature. It was easier than explaining the mess inside. But the problem was, the longer I wore it, the harder it was to take off. I think, deep down, I feared vulnerability. It felt safer to keep my true feelings hidden, to put on that Cheshire Cat grin, than to risk exposing the turmoil I was hiding. I didn't want people to see how fragile I felt, or how out of control my emotions sometimes were. There was a fear of being rejected, misunderstood, or worse, just being seen as too much for people to handle. Being vulnerable meant opening myself up to the possibility of judgment, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that. The Cheshire Cat could appear and disappear without consequence, offering no real solution. But I wasn't a magical creature with the ability to vanish at will. I couldn't hide my inner chaos the same way the cat could disappear with a flick of its tail. The longer I held onto the mask, the more it started to weigh me down. Wearing a mask may have kept me from being vulnerable, but it also deepened my sense of isolation. By shutting off my emotions and pretending everything was fine, I built a wall around myself. No one could see the real me, the version of me that was struggling, the version that had no idea how to cope with all the emotions swirling within. I wanted so badly to be understood, but I didn't know how to communicate what was happening. I didn't have the words, and I didn't know who would listen if I did. This feeling of isolation became suffocating. It was as if I was locked in a room by myself, with my own thoughts and emotions becoming a tangled mess that no one could see or untangle for me. The Cheshire Cat might have grinned at Alice's confusion, but in my life, there was no playful reassurance in that smile. The longer I kept up that charade, the more disconnected I became from the world around me. The smile might have fooled others, but it couldn't fool me. What I didn't realize at the time was that by constantly wearing the mask, I was putting immense pressure on myself. The more I suppressed, the heavier the burden became. It wasn't just emotionally exhausting. It affected my mental and physical health. The longer I pretended to be okay, the more I disconnected from my true feelings, and the more I isolated from myself, from those who genuinely cared about me. Eventually, the mask became unsustainable. It was like holding a smile in place for so long that it made my face started to ache. I couldn't keep up the act forever, and the exhaustion of hiding my true self took a toll on my emotional well-being. What I eventually realized was that, like Alice, I had to confront the chaos inside me. The Cheshire's grin might have been comforting in its ambiguity, but it wasn't the solution. Smiling through the chaos wasn't enough to heal what I was going through. I had to be brave enough to let the smile fade and face the emotions I'd been avoiding. It took time, but I began to learn that vulnerability wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. By opening up about my struggles, I started to let others in. I began to trust that people could handle the truth, that they could see me for who I really was and still love me for it. The more I allowed myself to be vulnerable, the more I realized I wasn't as alone as I had once believed. Like Alice, I learned that sometimes the journey through the chaos is where we find our truest selves. Not in the mask we wear to protect us, but in the raw honesty of confronting our inner world. And just like the Cheshire Cat, I realized that I didn't have to smile through the chaos. It was okay to let the mess show. Kind of like I am right now. In Alice in Wonderland, the Queen of Hearts is notorious for her temper. She rules over Wonderland with fiery passion, often ordering people's executions for the smallest offenses. Her volatile mood swings, from commanding her soldiers to off with their heads, to moments of sweetness and vulnerability, mirror the emotional instability that many of us experience in times of deep distress or dysregulation. She is impulsive, reactionary, and often consumed by emotions that seem to come and go without warning. To Alice, she is a force to be reckoned with, unpredictable and frightening, but ultimately a reflection of how overwhelming emotions can sometimes take control. For me, I saw myself in the Red Queen, the Queen of Hearts. I became reactionary and impulsive, letting emotions control me rather than the other way around. Like the Queen, I had no filter between the stimulus and the response. Everything was an emotional outburst waiting to happen. Much like the Queen's temper tantrums, my emotional state was often a roller coaster. One moment, everything was fine, and the next, something as small as passing comment or an unmet expectation could send me into a spiral. It felt like the smallest thing could tip me over the edge, like I was constantly walking on a tightrope of emotions. I never knew when the next trigger would come, and the uncertainty of that was exhausting. What I didn't understand at the time was that these emotional triggers weren't just about the moment. They were about the past wounds, unresolved feelings, and the inner chaos that I hadn't learned to process. But all I knew was that when something set me off, there was no stopping it. The Queen of Hearts' impulsivity resonated deeply with my own reactionary behavior. In that moment, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was reacting, lashing out, retreating, or shutting down in ways I couldn't control. It was like an emotional floodgate would open, and there was no way to close it once it started. When I was overwhelmed, I would lose all sense of control. I wasn't able to stop myself from reacting. It felt like I was swept away by a tide of emotions. Anger, frustration, fear, and all I could do was ride the wave. I didn't know how to pause, breathe, or think before I acted. I felt like a bystander in my own life, watching as these emotional surges took over and dictated my actions. The worst part of it was the aftermath. After the storm had passed, there was always this moment of clarity, but it came too late. In the quiet that followed, I would realize the damage that I had done. The hurtful things I said in anger, the moments I shut people out when I felt overwhelmed, or the way I pushed people away because I couldn't handle vulnerability. It wasn't just about the explosion of emotions, it was the guilt and shame that followed. The realization that I had acted in ways that weren't aligned with who I wanted to be. And then I would feel even worse, trapped in a cycle of emotional extremes that controlled my life. Like the Queen of Hearts, there was no thinking before reacting. If I felt something, it came out, loud, messy, and unfiltered, whether it was anger, sadness, or frustration. There was no space to process it or understand it, where it was coming from. It was pure instinct, a primal emotion reaction. I didn't have the tools to regulate myself, and because I didn't know how to manage my feelings, they overwhelmed me. Sometimes the impulse was to lash out, to say harsh or act in ways that I knew I would create distance between me and the others. Other times it was to shut out completely, to withdraw into myself, leaving the people around me confused and hurt. I was stuck in an emotional feedback loop, triggered by something, reacting without thinking, and then feeling ashamed of my behavior afterward. It felt like I had no control over how I expressed my emotions, and that made me feel powerless. When I wasn't lashing out, I was retreating, isolating myself in ways that didn't make sense, much like the dormouse in Alice in Wonderland, who constantly retreats into sleep to escape the chaos around him. I found myself pulling away from others when my emotions became too overwhelming. When I couldn't deal with the intensity of my feelings, I shut down completely. It was my way of coping, even when it wasn't a healthy way. Shutting down was a way to protect myself from the emotional overload. I would disappear, both physically and mentally, distancing myself from the people who cared about me. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to feel. Didn't want to be seen. But the isolation only added to the confusion and pain. It was like being stuck in my head, not knowing how to get out, unable to process what I was feeling, and unable to ask for help. After the emotional explosions or shutdowns, there was always a lingering sense of remorse. I would look back at the moments when I had lost control, and I'd be filled with guilt. Why didn't I stop myself? Why did I say those things? Why did I shut out people when I needed them the most? The remorse was the price I paid for my lack of emotional regulation. And it weighed and still weighs heavily on me. But the guilt was a double-edged sword. It didn't help me get better. It was only keeping me stuck in a cycle of self-blame. Instead of learning from my actions and making positive changes, I became trapped in a spiral of shame. The more I regretted my outbursts or my moments of withdrawal, the more I doubted my ability to manage my emotions in the future. It felt like I was constantly failing at something I couldn't quite control. Living like this was like walking through Wonderland, as if everything was a potential threat. I never knew when the next emotional crisis would strike. One moment, I would feel fine, and the next, something would trigger me, sending me into a fit of rage or causing me to retreat into silence. It was like I was living on edge of an emotional cliff, unsure of when I might fall. This unpredictability took a toll on my relationships, my sense of self, and my mental well-being. I couldn't trust myself because I didn't know who I would be from one moment to the next. The chaos that ruled my emotions ruled my life, and I was at its mercy. It took time, but I eventually realized that I couldn't continue living like this. The emotional extremes, the outbursts, the shutdowns, the guilt were unsustainable. I had to learn how to regulate my emotions, to create space between my feelings and my reactions. I had to stop being like the Queen of Hearts, reacting impulsively without thought, and start being more like Alice, thoughtful, reflective, and willing to explore what lay beneath the surface of my emotions. The Queen of Hearts may have ruled Wonderland with an iron fist, but I am learning to rule my emotions with more understanding and compassion. I don't have to be reactive or impulsive. I can pause, reflect, and choose a more thoughtful path. Alice didn't escape Wonderland. She learned how to navigate it, and that's what I had to do. A year and a half ago, I hit a turning point. I was exhausted from the emotional chaos and wondering how much longer I could live like this. I stopped asking myself, what's wrong with me? And began asking, why do I feel this way? That shift was everything. I realized that I didn't need to fix myself. I just needed to understand myself better. It was then that I started my mental health journey. I dove deep into DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, and everything began to make sense. I wasn't broken. I wasn't beyond help. I just needed the right tools to deal with my emotions, to stop letting them control me. Learning DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, was a game changer. It gave me the tools to pause before reacting, to notice my triggers, and to find healthier ways to express my emotions. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and there are still moments where I struggle, but I no longer feel like I'm at the mercy of my emotions. I've learned that it's okay to feel deeply, but it's not okay to let those feelings control me. That journey led me to something I never expected. I became a state-certified peer support specialist. I realized that everything I had been through, every struggle, every painful moment, wasn't just for nothing. I had experiences that could help others, and I wanted to share those experiences with you. So, dear Wanderers, welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. This podcast isn't about fixing yourself. It's about understanding yourself. It's about learning to navigate the mind's twists and turns, the highs and the lows, the madness and the brilliance. We'll explore together through the real talk about challenges of mental health, emotional regulation, and self-discovery. Until next time, keep wondering, and remember, sometimes falling is just the beginning. Yay me, yay you, and yay us.